Oh, hey, Chris.
Hey Chuck, how are you?
I am doing well on this fine Sunday morning. How are you?
It's fine. It's a rainy Sunday in St. Louis. I did not look at the weather when I planned out what I was going to cook today, so I'm hoping the weather gods allow me to get on my grill today, because otherwise I'll just have to make some adjustments.
Always thinking about food. I know how it works. What
Yeah.
uh, what other food items have been of interest to you lately?
Well, so interestingly enough, my wife and I went out on a date night last night, and I will say I was not satisfied with the dessert that I had at the restaurant. It was some abomination of tres leches, and my wife told me I was throwing a fit. She literally said, "You're throwing a fit. You need to stop." And I was like, "This is not tres leches. It's not soaked through. Like it was awful." So then I was like, "We need to get dessert somewhere else." So we went to one of our favorite ice cream shops, a local place in St. Louis called Clementine's Creamery, which I remember when they first opened in a different location, and we went there the first time they opened, and they just opened, so they were literally serving into like these like paper bowls you would get at Costco, and the smallest little scoops you've ever seen. It was like $8. So they've adjusted their model. They're flourishing now. They've got a nice shop in the DeMun region of Clayton, and incredibly busy on a Saturday night. I think it was like 9:30 or 10 by the time we got there. Line out the door, and we're in the line, and we're ordering our ice cream. And I was looked at Tiffany. I was like, that looks a little bit like Kylie Goldfarb. And I was like, she had a mask on and everything. I was like, no, there's no way. So I order my ice cream and everything, and then this very kind young woman hands me my ice cream and says, "Dr. D, right?" I was like, "Oh God, is this a patient?" She's like, and she immediately was like, Kylie Goldfarb. I was like, no way. I just told my wife that I thought that was you. So then obviously we snapped a selfie and sent it to you, Chuck.
I love it. I try to get my kids employed, and Kylie has worked. This is her second summer working at Clementine's, which really is a remarkable institution that is really growing by leaps and bounds. Couple other fun facts. One, Kylie may make more money than you or I make. It is unbelievable how well they do there. And two, the date of recording, which is July 17th, is National Ice Cream Day. So Kylie's working again today because they're expecting a surge of visitors.
That's fantastic. Well, the ice cream's fantastic there. They have one of those places that does like the boozy kind of ice creams too. What I really want to know is, what are the take-home perks of having your daughter work at Clementine's?
There are occasionally some. If we visit, sometimes we pay a little less, but then my wife says we got to give a bigger tip, and sometimes she'll bring something home for us. So, uh, she's getting stronger. Scooping ice cream all day is no easy task.
Yeah, I did text you last night saying there was no underside wrist pain going on at that at that creamery. I will say, it must be a nice discount, because I mean the pints are like $18 a piece, so it's got something crazy, a little inflated, but
Yeah, but they're doing something right. Speaking of doing something right, we have a special guest today, and I will give a very brief introduction because if I gave a long introduction, that would be the podcast. But we are lucky to have Farsh Guilak joining us today. That'll be a name that is not familiar to many of our listeners, but we are excited that Farsh is with us. He is the Mildred Simon Professor of Orthopedic Surgery. He is also the Director of Research at the Shriners Hospital, and he is a basic scientist who is doing really interesting work, is an influencer, is a podcaster, or at least a guest on podcasts. And so I am so happy to welcome Farsh to our show.
Well, thank you so much for having me. It's very, very exciting to be here, and I loved hearing about the ice cream. My wife came from an ice cream family. Her parents ran a series of Carvel stores in New York, so we had the real in, especially our kids, their grandkids, had the run of the store whenever we went there. So
oh
ice
man,
cream is very important.
I do love a Carvel cake, man. I'm not gonna lie, that is one of my favorite things in the whole world. I have not had one. Well, cookie crumble situation on there, so good, so good.
Mhm.
So Farsh has a lot to share with us, and we're going to do a little background conversation, and then we'll jump into some interesting things. And I think for any hand surgeons or trainees or therapists who are wondering, do I really want to continue? I think you do. I think you will learn something interesting and maybe take away some pearls that impact your daily life. So stay with us. And Farsh, so I
Well,
know you.
let me tell them
Oh,
one reason to listen. this man or one of his many mentees / disciples, they're going to cure arthritis, and it's going to be crazy. And we're going to put a lot of our arthroplasty colleagues out of business, and they're going to be really sad. But everybody's going to be really happy that Farsh and his team have cured arthritis. So that is your teaser. And the other one I'll say, and we'll get to this, is that he has won the Kappa Delta Award from the Academy / ORS 3 times. That's like winning the WWF championship 3 times, like 10 years apart. It's like the Michael Phelps of orthopedic research. So this is an amazing researcher. And honestly, I had the most fun getting to know him during residency interviews a few years ago. That was an incredible day. And we spent the day together in my office and just interviewing people. And that was some of the most fun I've had doing that. And that's one of the reasons why it's so nice to interview with your colleagues who you would not have otherwise met. So Farsh, thank you for joining us. I'm excited to hear about your journey and what you can share with our audience.
Oh, absolutely.
So I have to, we try to share a little bit about ourselves, Farsh, as we do this podcast. And I'm a basketball lover. I don't know if you love basketball. I know you're an accomplished racquetball player, and hopefully we'll get to that. But as Chris was talking about your 3 Kappa Deltas, all I could see was Steph Curry playing basketball. When he hits a 3, he does the 1, 2, 3. So I'm thinking about that. I'm not sure you're doing that at home, but I like the visual.
No, I haven't done that. They're spaced far enough apart that I wasn't even thinking about it. So.
All right, so let's do some quick background work. So did you grow up in New York? You went to RPI, Rensselaer Polytech Institute, which I know well, but some may not.
I grew up in Houston, Texas. So I was actually born in Iran. My parents were both physicians, and they ended up moving in 1970 to Houston to work at Baylor. And they soon went into private practice after that. They were, physicians who wanted to be scientists, but the opportunities weren't quite there. So I grew up in Houston, and then I went off to upstate New York, about 100-degree temperature difference, and then to Columbia after that.
And what was it? Your parents who sort of set you on the path of science and discovery? Or was that something you picked up on your own along the way? Or did you have influential mentors at RPI or Columbia?
I think all of those. And for all of us who are either in science or medicine, you're just born with it. And, I think both my older brother, who's an engineer, and I knew we were going to be science or medicine people growing up. And I was, of course, surrounded by medicine, and I worked in my parents' offices, and I was headed to the medical track. And I was actually pre-med, did all the classes, took the MCATs, and I just couldn't decide research or medicine or both. And I thought, okay, I'll just go do a master's degree and learn about research. And then here I am. I just went straight through after that. I fell in love with research. And in retrospect, it was absolutely the right decision for me and my personality and what I like to do. I didn't know it at the time, but sometimes you've got to try things out to really learn what they are. So my mentors, of course, were my parents, who were physicians, my brother, and then so many mentors during college, and of course my PhD mentor, who was one of the pioneers of cartilage and arthritis research. Van Mao was his name, but he was focused on cartilage mechanics. And he really established the field of cartilage mechanics and how joints work, and how a joint can withstand 10 times your body weight for, as we know, a million cycles a year for 80 years normally. And then why does it break down? So he really established that field. But I think my true mentors were my graduate student class, the 4 or 5 grad students who were with me at the same time. And we still, to this day, meet regularly, discuss everything. But during graduate school, they were the ones who, for each of us, we inspired each other. And from them, I learned so much about how to do research. I ended up marrying one of them, and the others are still my best friends to this day.
Yeah, that sounds a lot like people's reflections on their residency classes, if their residencies were tight or if they're in a bigger fellowship. They're co-fellows, because that resonates with me, at least. I still keep in touch with, I didn't marry any of them. So, but we still keep in touch. So did you do your graduate work at Columbia?
Yes. Yeah.
Okay.
Did my PhD there. And at that time, there was only a department of mechanical engineering. So the field of biomedical engineering had been founded, but very few schools had actual departments. So my training is actually in mechanical engineering, and I had, take all the courses, classic mechanical engineering courses of heat transfer and statics and dynamics and vibrations, and take a 18-hour test on all of those, and then I went to study cartilage. So
do you think that having that broader background actually made you better in terms of as if you had a BME track now, would you have gone through the BME track, or do you advise your students to go through kind of a broader basis?
I think it really depends on your interests. And at the PhD level, it's so much about who you work with and the project, less than that. I can tell you, I rarely use any of those courses, but what I did learn was how fundamentally aligned large fields of engineering are. So when you wonder, why are all those different topics in one department? Well, you understand how the theoretical basis that drives heat transfer and fluid flow and solid mechanics and vibrations actually all comes from the same line of physics. So it's an amazing education. I don't know that I would recommend that to someone who now, for example, my students, I have several who are mechanical engineering students, a large majority who are biomedical engineering students, and then a few who are biology students. And we can now tailor their education to really what they want to do, and say, all right, I have mechanical engineers who really want to do fundamental mechanics with a biological slant, and then I have other students who are doing hardcore biology and use an engineering approach. The way we, as engineers, you look at a problem, and what we do is sort of like a toaster that doesn't work. You take it apart, figure out how it works, and then put it back together again. And what we're trying to do is do that and put it back together again better than it was before. So that type of education translates into all of the different departments, but the classes you take and where you focus, I think, can be tailored to every student differently.
Yeah, it's interesting. I think you're ahead of the classic medical field, I guess I would say, given our broader based approach with eventual tapering. Seems like you guys may focus a little earlier. I don't know.
Yeah, well, we have that debate in hand surgery. I mean, that the recent meeting in London, I was part of a symposium that was, should you do orthopedics or plastics first and then do hand fellowship training, like broader base and then narrow down? Or we know you want to be a hand surgeon, why don't we just shoot you through after 5 years straight hand surgery residency like they do in some of the Scandinavian countries. So I think that there are pluses and minuses to each approach. I do appreciate the broader basis of multiple disciplines and seeing, like you said, how a lot of things come from the same line of thinking eventually. I think at the end of the day, you just want to teach people how to think.
Exactly. It's more about teaching problem solving, how to think, where to find answers on your own, because many of our students don't go into academia. Some of them, a few, don't go into research, but they may go into a very different area where they still need to learn how to problem solve, but they're not necessarily working on cartilage or arthritis, but they've learned the process, and that's what the PhD is more about than anything else.
Yeah, makes sense. So your first stop after Columbia, as I understand it, was at Duke University, which certainly were formative years and important years. And I want to get to the transition to Washington University, but tell us a little bit about Duke. How was that impactful for you, and what did you accomplish while there?
Well, Duke was a phenomenal place. I loved my collaborators there. I loved my students there. It was, really high level of functioning and expectation from that educational side. And Duke did have one of the oldest, probably either number one or number two oldest departments of biomedical engineering. So that thought, that establishment that engineering and medicine should be linked was really ingrained there, which was one of the main reasons we ended up going there. And they're all, both schools are on one campus. So going to the engineering school was a 3 to 5 minute walk. And vice versa. So we had students going back and forth. That environment is really hard to beat because you get truly integrated education and research. so that was the main reason I went there, and it was really a great experience, a great place to start building a career. And that's where I started to move my research from what was mostly cartilage mechanics that I trained in, where I started to look at this field we call mechanobiology, which is sort of the counterpart of biomechanics, where it's how do mechanical factors affect living cells. So, we know that most of the tissues in our bodies respond to mechanical loading, and certainly in the musculoskeletal system, right? You load your muscles, they grow, load your bones, they grow. If you don't load them, they atrophy. Well, that happens to pretty much every tissue in your body, and especially in your cartilage, which was understudied. It's just the right level of loading. If you immobilize a joint, the cartilage atrophies. If you overload it, you can get arthritis and degeneration. So I started to move into that area and really start to, dissect those pathways to try to figure out, how does a cell respond to loading, and then how can we make that a drug target for arthritis? How can we find pharmaceutical drugs that can manipulate whether your cells are being loaded or not? And then the other area we moved in a little bit later was the burgeoning field of course, stem cells, and this new field that had just formed called tissue engineering, which is not so new anymore, but the concept that we could take some cells and some biomaterials, and in the right environment outside the body, we can regrow tissues. And we had all these ideas on how we were going to rebuild cartilage and replace it and grow it in the lab, starting about 15 years ago. And I'm very excited to say that we are hopefully starting the clinical trials for that project with Dr. Clohissy here at WashU this year. So it's been a long haul, but that's where those ideas started and were seeded.
That's amazing. And, congratulations on taking that from literally bench to bedside and from idea to reality. That's super exciting. And one of the things I've always admired about you is that you have a body of work, and you've had multiple bodies of work, and they've evolved over time. And one of the things that I think the people listening that are in training right now and may have an interest in academic careers is, how do you plan something out like that? Like, do you just have like this huge idea and then you eventually build towards it? And how do you kind of roll with the punches along the way when the experiments don't shake out the way you expect them to, or your funding gets pulled, or you don't get the grant you're expecting? And, how do you keep the big picture in mind without, being overwhelmed by it?
Chris, that's a great question. And in a probably the healthiest way I could say it is probably an obsession. That once I started working on this problem, and I'm still working on the same problem in the big picture that I was working on in graduate school, that it's so complex. It sounds so simple, like how does this, tissue in your body work, this cartilage, how do your joints work? And then 30 something years later, I still can't let go of the problem. And it's complex enough that I haven't been able to actually solve it or answer it. And no, our whole field hasn't. It's not just me. It's just a really interesting problem. So in one sense, yes, it is, I know what we wanted to solve for the last 30 years, but it's like a sawtooth that you have an advance, but most of the time you're just doing little incremental work. And it's like Kuhn, there's the structure of scientific revolutions. Most of what we do is incremental in a good way. You just got to move the field forward. You got to dot the I's, cross the T's. And then once in a while, you either have an idea that comes together or an association or a new technology oftentimes, and you get the jump in the sawtooth and you move things forward. And of course, there's lots of moving backwards too. And experiments, if every experiment worked, then you're wasting your time because you already know the answer. So, you want to get the majority to work, but that's the fun part, is doing things that are risky, and you de-risk them by putting a lot of thought into it and saying, all right, I can see the path, this should work, everything I've read tells me this should work, but we don't know the answer, so we've got to do it and test it. And I'd say 4 out of 5 times we get close. Sometimes it's just a failure, and that's okay. That's how we learn and retool.
So we talk about this, when, learning when something doesn't go right, not obsessing about adverse outcomes, but yet, helping yourself and future patients move forward. Talk a little about that process. Major failures, minor failures, how do they help you?
that is one of the most important topics in science and in research right now. And the reason for that is we're just set up for failure. So our grant funding rate nominally is 10%. So that means the average person, you have to submit 10 grants to get one. High-level journal publications can be 5% acceptance to the solid journals that are 25 to 30%. Experiments, as I said, a lot of them just fail. So maybe the project 4 out of 5 times will work in the end. The experiments, half the time they don't work. So I have thought about this a lot because we have this younger generation, and I've thought, how do we teach resilience? Because that's what it really takes to understand that failure is not, it's not failure in the bad sense of the word. It's just part of the process. And if you adjust yourself and say, okay, I've got to do this 10 times before I get it to work once, then it's very different than, oh, I failed 9 times in a row, should I quit now? So what we learn is, you got to figure out, why did things fail, and take responsibility. If you don't get a grant funded or paper funded, I say, what did we do wrong? You can't say, oh, that reviewer was awful, they didn't understand us. We have to say, we didn't explain it properly. As much as it hurts to say, we know we were right, but we still have to suck it up and say, okay, do better, explain things better, design that experiment better, be more careful. And that's just the process. And I think once you accept that it's just, those are the odds, you've got to play the odds, you've got to play the game and go back and don't quit. And we see time and time again in our field that success comes from resilience. Everybody around us is brilliant. Everybody around us has got the perfect scores and the board scores and the grades, and everybody works hard. So who sticks with it? They're the ones who get the answers oftentimes. And that goes back to my obsession. I've stuck with this for 30 years and keep going at it and answer one little question at a time.
I know Chris has got a question. I'm going to jump in. Sorry, Chris. Just a very quick follow-up. Are you intentional in how you teach that concept to your team and your mentees, or is it modeling, or is it both?
I'm evolving a method to teach it intentionally, because it's not an easy thing to teach, right? But a lot of it is discussion. So we have a weekly lab meeting, we have 30 people in the lab, and one person presents in detail, a second person gives a short talk on something they learned. And then every couple of months, we talk about some big picture item like this. And there's so much going on in our careers, in our world, that we have to talk about things like this. And so one of the talks, which is more, an open discussion, but to bring up these points, and we have failures and successes in the lab. And part of being deliberate about it is talking about both, not just the successes, but saying, okay, here's where we tried and it didn't work. Here's what we're going to try to do, and hopefully it'll work the next time, but it may not. And in the big picture, all the different things that everyone is trying to accomplish, scientific and career-wise. So I'm trying to make it more deliberate. There's no textbook for it that I found, and no clear path. But I certainly found that talking about it, making it okay to talk about it, is a good first step.
It sounds like a textbook maybe the ORS could lead, because I think these are not to use a bad, the wrong phrase, but soft skills that are so important, that I think that actually brings me to my question. One of the things that you are known for is your skill at being a mentor. You've won institutional and national awards for mentoring, and that's incredible. And that's something that all of us can learn from. And one of the other more recent episodes we've had that's been pretty popular is about intergenerational differences. And have you adjusted your mentoring style over the last couple of decades to meet the current generation of graduate student, undergraduate student, postdoc? Because personality-wise, I think they are probably a little different than they were 10, 15 years ago.
That's a great question. I don't know that I've changed too much. I still try to keep a relatively informal relationship with them, even though now there's a much bigger age gap. But I think what I've incorporated now that I didn't have before is what I would call reverse mentoring, where I rely on the younger members of the lab to keep me informed on what are those soft skills and communication skills and even terminology that I can use to communicate with that generation. I have not found them to be any of the stereotypes that we talk about of not wanting to work as hard, not being as well trained or as ambitious. And in that regard, I think maybe we've been very fortunate because our students here are phenomenal and our postdocs here are phenomenal. And I haven't really had to change anything. I think what I've learned, and this, this comes, sometimes it comes naturally, sometimes you have to learn it as a mentor. And part of it comes from, all right, published a few hundred papers now. Like what's really your legacy? What are you going to leave? And what you realize is that your mentee's success is your success. And once you really ingrain that when you see them succeed, they're not competition, they're not detracting from you, it is just pure pride. And I think that transition, whether it was, discreet or not, for me, it's very obvious now. And I am most proud of where my trainees are now. And right now I have 7 past trainees on our faculty in orthopedics here. So, Deepti Jain and John Backus, they were my trainees at Duke. They spent a year in the lab, and then 5 of our postdocs are now research faculty in the department. And I couldn't be more proud of them.
That's incredible. I have 2 follow-up questions. One, how do you celebrate your successes and not only discuss your failures? I, for one, Chris, I think is better at this than I am. I tend to, and my successes are smaller than either of yours, but I don't tend to celebrate. I just tend to move on to the next. I don't think that's necessarily healthy. What do you do? How do you celebrate with your team, Farsh?
We just mark those successes. It has a whole range. So, for our students especially, there are a series of events that, hoops they have to jump through, like passing their qualifying exam and their prelim exam and their defense. And especially as they move further along, those become bigger and bigger parties. So when someone defends their PhD, we are going to all go out somewhere, either to, pandemic notwithstanding, come, have a picnic, come to our house, go to a restaurant, make a big deal about those things. But we also, even the little things like a paper getting accepted, it's not so little. Someone's, first author paper, at least acknowledging it, bringing it up in lab meetings, letting everyone know why it's a big deal and why we're proud of it. I tend to celebrate my own accomplishments less, just because it's just, after you've failed and succeeded so many times, it's less of an issue. But to just bring it up because almost all of them are a group effort, and there's very few things that, if any, certainly scientifically, that belong to one person. It's just such a collaborative discipline right now. So celebrating that team success is very important, and making sure that everyone knows they're part of that team and what roles they play in it is just really important. If nothing else, not letting things gloss over and say, oh, that's just daily business. We don't care about another paper or this milestone that you went through.
No, I love that. And I guess I don't really have another question, but your mentorship comments are incredibly important. And actually, it's an area of growth for me. For a long time, I would simply say I'm going to be a mentor by example. And that doesn't cut it, honestly. I mean, I think you can do that, but it's not enough. And so that's something I am intentionally going to be working on moving forward. So I personally appreciate your comments. I think they're spot on.
Yeah, the mentorship process is, I mean, there are those sides of it where certainly you have to be the example. If you teach something and then you are something else, that undermines what you're doing. So you've got to be the example, but it's also got to be much more deliberate. And every trainee is different. So I think understanding what each person is looking for. I have trainees that I literally will talk to or communicate with, usually, Slack, text, whatever, 10, 15 times a day. And I have other ones who check in once every few weeks, and that's what works for each of them. And as long, this is my only job, so I have the time to do those things. You are balancing multiple things and being pulled in the oar. So it's also having the time to spend like that and be able to keep a running commentary and give immediate feedback. And one of the things is positive or negative immediate feedback is really important for the mentees, that you acknowledge, you see what they did, and it's good or bad. Usually it's good, but just letting them know that was something positive and you saw it and acknowledged it. I think those are really important things that go a very long way.
I think those are great points. I mean, for us, that in our world, that's in the OR. Somebody
absolutely.
does something. It's easy to point out when somebody does something not so great. There are certain things you can say in the moment, certain things you maybe should reserve, for private moments. But when somebody does something well, making sure that they know that, and Marty talks about it, when he talks about how he gives feedback, I love the way you use your scissors there. I love the way you use the scalpel. I like the way you put that screw in. That I think helps sustain the relationship when you're at least teaching something that is relatively, tactical. But I think the point's well made for other things, and it certainly extends to research. I have a question.
Sorry, I was just going to say that is a great example, what you're describing, of how we try to catch people doing something right. Usually you're trying to catch people doing something wrong. But if you pop in the lab or something comes across your desk that was done right, you caught them, and then you surprise them with the kudos. It goes a long way.
Right. So the question I had for you, one of the episodes that Chuck and I are going to do pretty soon is an episode about uncertainty. We're going to talk about an article from HBR that talks about, how to embrace it, how to look at it as a positive at times. And for you, you went from being incredibly established and accomplished, and you could have finished out your career at Duke. But you took the leap to come to Wash U at a point where you were, kind of in the LeBron James mode. You could pick your spots. You could either stay where you were, or you could go wherever you want. And how did you? What was the impetus for that? And how did you struggle at all with the uncertainty of, now I got to go somewhere else and establish myself again? Or what were the considerations running through your mind as you weighed staying at Duke versus moving institutions?
Oh, I definitely struggled with that. And so, research, when you build a research laboratory, it takes decades. You train people, you build these research projects, and there is so much luck involved in getting a research lab to work and getting research funding. And I have plenty of little stories where, especially when I first started, and, first couple of years, I had one tiny grant and nobody in the lab, and things looked like they were going to end. And so I just wrote 6 grants and got 5 of them. And all of a sudden I went from being out of business to having 12 people in the lab. And, those types of luck situations and getting those right people and building that lab, I didn't know if I could repeat it. I didn't know if I could move somewhere, start over, build a laboratory again, and do it in a reasonable time period, and have the ability, the thought process, and the luck to do it again. So I feel very fortunate that I was able to do it. But that said, at some time, it is actually really helpful to start over and come in and be able to drop things that you don't want to do and start really new projects. And I came here because of the leadership. And I've known Dr. Regis O'Keefe for decades. And when he took the position here as department chair, before he even moved here, he called me up and he said, we have this position, and it's between WashU, which was, as you well know, it's been the #1 NIH funded and most highly recognized Center for Orthopedic Research for quite a while. He said, we have this position, and we also have this position at Shriners. And it was an opportunity that I would not have anywhere else, to build that huge laboratory that we have with the incredible support of the Shriners. And it was just a fantastic opportunity to try to start over and create a new environment. And yes, it's a risk, and there was some uncertainty, but I had to do it.
Yeah, it's actually Chris asked the question that I wanted to, and that's great. I think, in respect for your time, I want to sort of bring this to a close, but with a really important concept. And we could talk about the science forever, and I look forward to learning more about the science. But I want to close with work-life balance. And as I see it, you have an incredibly busy work life. You have a significant other, a spouse who is incredibly successful, and you have a history of being a racquetball player. Talk to us about how you think about balance, because Chris and I both struggle with it.
Balance is so important if we want to use that word. And I'm not sure I always like that word, because it implies like you're on a seesaw, and if you add more work, you should add more play. And then you start to crush yourself by trying to do more. It's more like a pendulum. You go back and forth and it swings in multiple directions, or you're juggling balls, but some of those balls are made of glass and some are made of rubber, right? And you can drop the rubber balls, they'll bounce back. You can't drop the family ball, which is made of glass, and you've got to make sure where your priorities are. For me, having that balance and having extracurricular activities, whatever they are, and for many of us, it's exercise or some sport or some hobby, or of course family. If I don't do that, I don't have the energy to do my real job. It's not like it's taking time away. It's actually energizing to create the ability to do what I need to do. So it's not even a number of hours. There are a lot of hours in the day. I don't run out of time. Usually I run out of energy and mental energy. If I'm working on a paper or a grant or something, you could always work more hours, not do other things, but I run out of the ability to actually do that work. And if you find things, and it takes a little while to find what energizes you, and you've got to know yourself, and you've got to try different things. And for many people, it's, friends, it's socializing, it's watching sports, it's playing a musical instrument. If you don't do those things, I find then you just burn out. And this is another thing, this is one of our other lab topics, is burnout, because if you burn out, you're no good to anyone. So I'd rather have people work half as much and be efficient and stay with it than to work 80 hours a week and not be able to stick with the career and with the job and just give up on it. So I don't know if that makes sense, but I think each person has to figure it out for themselves of what actually energizes you. And some people do want to work 80 or 100 hours a week, and they're on one side of the bell curve, and for most of us, we're in the middle. We've got to do other things and enjoy life. And you get one life, you've got to enjoy it.
Chris,
I think that's well said. What I love about what you said is the energizing part of it, because I think that in many ways, if you don't fill that bucket with the stuff that's in that glass ball, you're just going to be flat at work. Like you're going to go into whatever in our world, patient interactions or research projects, just with no energy, no motivation. And I think that, one of the things I try to talk to our trainees about when we talk about this topic, and I agree with you, is definitely more of a rhythm and a pendulum as opposed to a balance, is just finding the things that energize you and then optimizing when your energy is at its peak for the things that you need to do. Trying to do anything academic after 9 o'clock at night is just not going to happen. It's just forcing it. And yes, I'll do okay work, but my best work comes in the morning. And I recognized that when I was a fellow. I just needed that time in the morning. I woke up super early, and that's when I would read for cases and everything else. And I think it's just understanding yourself. Everybody's different. Nobody's gonna, I can't run my life the way that Chuck does, the way that Marty does, the way that Ryan does. I mean, everybody's different. So I think that if you can recognize that early on in your training and early on in practice, you're going to be just better set to succeed.
Absolutely.
Farsh?
Well, I would love to thank Farsh for joining, and listeners, if you would like to hear more about the science, because I certainly do, please let us know, and we will have Farsh back just to talk about science. But honestly, we could talk to Farsh about a lot of things that really relate to everything that we do in the world of taking care of people with hand injuries. So Farsh, thank you for joining us.
Thank you for having me. Thank you for doing this podcast. It's fantastic. And it's just a true service to the society and our community. So it's a delight to be here.
Thank you so much. Have a great day.
You too. Bye-bye.